thank you so much for having me, everyone, at Fawcett. It's what an amazing panel to be part of. It's brilliant. So I'm really so happy to be here. I just want to quickly start by outlining the problem, because what you just said, actually, Aisha, about the fact that we had a housing crisis before all this, and what's happened is that we've had a housing crisis kind of collide with the worst public health crisis in living memory, and the people in the fallout of that are women. And so I want to be really clear about that. So I just want to start, because I often get asked, I'm a feminist, I'm very publicly a feminist, leading an organisation that is sort of supposed to be, in lots of people's eyes, gender neutral. And I'm often asked, why do you keep talking about women when most homeless people are men? Well, I just want to be clear about that. So most rough sleepers are men. That's absolutely true. There are lots of reasons for that, partly because of the danger of rough sleeping for everyone, but particularly for women. So the average age of death for someone sleeping rough is about 47 for men and about 43 for women. Just let that sink in for a minute, and then also say that's the only section of the population where women die younger than men do. Yes, most rough sleepers are men, and of course their needs are really severe and they need to be looked after totally. But the hidden homeless, there are hundreds of thousands of homeless people in this country, and I want to just explain why that issue disproportionately impacts women. And I just want to say, I'm going to make, this is such an obvious point to make at a Fawcett event, so forgive me, but our economy is designed to favour men over women, right? That's how it's constructed. So when we decide we need a bit of austerity, which is in itself, a construct, it's not something inevitable. I just need to turn my power on, sorry. Right, beg your pardon, otherwise I'm going to disappear. So our economy is designed to favour men over women. So when we need to save money, supposedly, we do not raise taxes. If we did that, if that was our main solution, that would disproportionately impact men. We don't do that. We cut public services, and that disproportionately impacts women, because women disproportionately both work in and receive public services, okay? So right away from the start off, the way the whole system is designed favours men over women. Now, I know that's an obvious point because it's a patriarchy, right? We all know that. So I'm stating the blindingly obvious, but it is important, right? And so what that means, again, this is quite an obvious point, but we need big, supposedly gender neutral organisations like Shelter, and I include myself in this, to stop using gender neutral language. So when we keep talking about homeless families, for example, we need to be clear that we are mainly talking about single mothers and their children. We are talking about women, and we need to kind of make that visible in the discourse. And we need to recognise that because women are disproportionately in lower paid jobs, that means that they are disproportionately impacted by the housing crisis. So at Shelter, we're seeing, and now even more, women who are in caring roles, both formal and informal, junior roles in hospitality, again, often women. And we need to recognise within that the disproportionate impact on women of colour. And when I'm talking about the disproportionate impact on women and on women of colour, going back to that point about the economy that I made earlier, that is because of the contribution of women and women of colour to our society, right? So the decisions that we make, we don't raise taxes, we slash public services and public spending, right? That impacts women disproportionately, and it impacts them because of the contribution they make to our society. So when we're outside clapping, outside our houses, right, and when we're talking about the negative impacts of the pandemic, we need to be clear that we are talking about women, and we're talking about women and particularly women of colour, because of the huge contribution that they're making. And it's kind of what was touched on earlier about nurses, but it is nurses, of course, and it's wider than nurses as well. So just to be really clear then, if you look at homeless families with children living in temporary accommodation, 71% of those are single parents. And we know that over 90% of single parents are women, right? So that means statistically, women are much more likely to be homeless and living in temporary accommodation. And in fact, if you just look at all adults, so irrespective of whether they're parents or not in temporary accommodation, even if you discount the parents, right, it's still 61% women. So women are more likely to be impacted by homelessness, right? And if you look at people in private renting, female private renters are about 1.5 times more likely to be claiming local housing allowance, which is housing benefit for people in private renting, right, than men. So women in private renting basically are less likely to be able to afford their rent. That's not surprising. We've already talked about how women are poorer than men are. So they're more likely to be hit by discrimination against people on housing benefit when they're looking for somewhere to live, like no DSS policies, which anyone who's living in private renting will know all about. That disproportionately impacts women. And in fact, we've won several court cases now, actually, proving that this is unlawful discrimination, indirect discrimination, because it impacts women. But they are still hit by no DSS. But also, the government has just refrozen local housing allowance from April, right? So that means that rents will be unaffordable if you're on a low income in more than 90% of the country. And let's be really clear what this means for women. It means women are choosing between paying their rent and paying their bills, buying food, buying basic clothing, right? So that is the true picture of unaffordability. And if women are not able to afford their rent, that is the main reason. Eviction from a private tenancy is the main reason why people become homeless. So it is really clear that women are desperately overrepresented among people who are homeless and are desperately at risk right now, because we're about to see a huge increase in unemployment, and we're about to see the freezing of local housing allowance. And that means that private rents are going to be unaffordable to huge numbers of women. And then that overrepresentation that I already talked about within the group of particularly families, particularly people with children in homeless and in temporary accommodation. And just to say, temporary accommodation isn't nice, right? It's not a nice place to be living, just to be totally clear. So I've seen women and children in the pandemic, right, trying to socially distance, and they're in a bed and breakfast hotel. So you've got a corridor, you've got a load of rooms either side of the corridor. Most of them have got a single mum with kids in it. And then at one end, you've got a shared bathroom. And at the other end, you've got a shared kitchen, right? So that is being a homeless single mother in the pandemic. Let's be really clear about this. This is not a great environment to be in. And this is going to it can only get worse because we're only seeing the beginning of the economic crisis. So someone else made the point earlier, yes, the virus, it appears, has killed more men. I'm not discounting that as a really serious issue, by the way. But the economic crisis is going to be a gendered crisis. It's going to cause homelessness. It's going to make women homeless. And we really have to start talking about that.
Can't you see it too? There's an elephant in the room.